Hello, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. In this episode, we're diving into a pressing issue that's reshaping our work and career landscapes, the reskilling emergency, the age of the continuous newbie. As technology rapidly automates tasks, the nature of jobs is changing, often leaving us feeling like we're always starting anew. So in this episode, we'll look first at where we've seen successful examples of reskilling. Next, we'll identify three major drivers that underpin this trend, that are forcing us to consider the urgent need for continuous learning. Is it just technology, or are there other factors at play? Then we'll explore the potential futures of reskilling by 2030, looking at both optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. Then finally, we'll discuss what organisations can start doing today to prepare their teams for this new reality. How can businesses foster an environment of continuous learning and adaptation? And I'm delighted to welcome co-founder of Working the Future, Kat Barnard, back to our podcast. And this is the seventh of our collaborative series of these podcasts, all associated with that wonderful report of yours, Kat, looking at the underlying drivers and trends in the future of work. So a warm welcome back.
Thank you, Steve.
So let's start with that first question then. Where have we already seen examples of reskilling, and what do they look like?
So I think it's really important that we take a moment to reflect upon the kind of the societal backdrop, because we continue to live in a world that that suggests that the bulk of our education take place at the start of our lives in educational facilities, which isn't helpful, is it really? Because if you think about the pace of change over the last 30 to 40 years and the impact that digital and computing have had on the way that we live our lives, I think we could all agree that as citizens, we are continuous learners, because we're always shaping our lives and adapting to new technological forces. So if you think about the way in which we have assimilated mobile broadband, smart devices, more recently things like Alexa, and those kind of interactive listening devices into our home. If you think about even things like, basic household functionality, most homes in 2024 are infinitely more technological than they were even 20 years ago. So we're constantly integrating new technology and adapting the whole time. But the backdrop is that learning takes place at school up until the age of 21 if you go to university, and thereafter you may or may not be lucky enough to work with an employer that allocates a small amount of budget to your training needs every year. And it's just, those two things are just completely incompatible, aren't they, really? The way that our structure is organized is not representative of the pace of change in modern life.
I think that's a really interesting observation there about the kind of the pace of change, or the nature of continuous change, and our organizations and the way that organizations encourage us to learn. It's very kind of stepwise, isn't it? It's, there's a problem emerging, so we'll learn to fix that, and then we're okay, and we can sit back and relax, and then another problem emerges. Instead of actually adopting, kind of almost intuitively, if you like, the idea that everything is constantly changing, so we constantly have to renew ourselves. I mean, one of the things that sprung to mind as you were talking then was digital literacy. And the more I think about some of the things that you were talking about there, the broader this concept of digital literacy is. When I first started talking about it, I used to say, well, actually, we don't mean just coding. What we actually mean is having knowledge so we can make informed choices about the digital technology we employ. But actually, it's much broader than that even, isn't it? It's almost every time we have an interaction with some kind of device,
Yeah.
we should be understanding the implications of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, understanding the implications of interacting with digital tech is quite a philosophical ask, isn't it, actually? Because to me, that denotes exploration of the kind of the considerations of the unforeseen consequences,
Yeah.
the unanticipated consequences. But even things as subtle as, I mean, Kevin Kelly, who is was the co-founder of Wired magazine, which is a Bay Area originating magazine that reported on latest technological developments. Now, he's got to be, I'm imagining he's in his 60s, 70s now. But he wrote a book in 2016 called The Inevitable, which explored the forces that he thought were most going to impact daily life. And he in the early stages of that book, I remember reading, because I was absolutely astonished about the pace and proliferation of smartphone apps. And he had researched and found that the average life cycle of an app is 30 days. Simply, there are so many of them. There are so many to choose from. And of course, they remain live and in existence if consumers are interacting with them. But the point that that data point underscored a more prescient point, which is that there are so many different platforms, tools, interfaces, apps, etc., just coming into our sphere of existence on a daily and weekly basis, that we are, to quote him, nothing more than perpetual newbie. Because, and I think this is true in 2024, literally every week you boot up your laptop to get a good, a day's work done, and you're confronted with, an interface that needs updating, or a system that worked last week that is no longer compatible. Quite literally this morning, we're hosting a webinar next month in June, and I've had an open ticket with a very well-known events booking platform for the past week, because all of a sudden I can't integrate Zoom into the well-known booking platform. And first and foremost, I raised a ticket when I had managed to navigate my way through a really sophisticatedly and prohibitive fax center. I managed to find the way to raise the ticket, and 72 hours later, I literally got the download of what was ostensibly a chatbot chat that was no use to me whatsoever. So then I had to just reply and say, that's great, but here's a screenshot of the issue. And another 96 hours later, I get another reply that doesn't give me the answer to my problem, but makes me think, oh, maybe it's a browser thing. And actually, I fixed the problem by disconnecting the Zoom. But, these integration issues, they are all day long, and you have to be mentally on your front foot all the time, because otherwise it's just overwhelming.
Yeah, that's interesting. The frustrations of technology. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't, it's not.
But increasingly, it doesn't seem to be working for us. So there's one thing about how we as humans adapt to increasingly digital environments. Then there's another layer, which is how do we cope with and respond to platforms that are not all that they have been promised to be.
Yeah.
There's a massive integration issue, germanely, which is that too few of these tools interface well with one another. So the experience is anything but seamless. And on top of that, throw into the mix a gaslighting government that is accusing everybody in the country of work shy, quiet quitting type behaviors. And I would argue, I don't think people set out to be unproductive. I think they're just constantly battling a new world landscape where there's very little support provided by organizations to help people just deal with the day-to-day complexities of living in an all digital environment.
Can I just pick up on that point you mentioned there about this kind of new world landscape? Because one of the things that we were talking about before we started on the podcast was the proficiency or otherwise for leaders in organizations to think about an uncertain future and how we factor those potential insights back into what we do. So what kind of role do you see things like uncertainty, complexity, also playing into this kind of reskilling emergency? Is that part of the emergency situation, or do you think it is predominantly technology driven?
I think we have to normalize complexity. I think we're in this, where we are in 24, I think we're at a sort of a crossroads of deep denial and deflection. We're desperate to go back to pre-COVID economic stability, for want of a better word. Although, if you actually look at the hard data, 2019 wasn't stable in any way, shape, or form. It was just a lot more stable than things are now. But this idea that we can return to some kind of business as usual and therefore resume growth is idiotic, isn't it? And actually, if we were, as an alternative, to say, look, complexity is here to stay. What does that mean? Let's understand, let's collectively undertake some learning to identify what it means germanely, what it means in our specific setting, what we can do as a collective of individuals to counter complexity, to learn to work with complexity. What are the new work-based practices that we need in order to successfully navigate complexity? And arguably, what is needed there is collective intelligence, a hive mind, far greater collaboration, decentralized decision making, and decentralized organization. It's absolutely not an elite squad of business strategists sat on the fourth floor in, the sort of the gilded boardroom away from everybody else, deciding what's best for the organization. The best analogy that I can think of for an organization in 2024 is that it is a living, breathing organism with exemplary sense-making capacities. If only those sense-making capacities were recognized as such and actually rewarded as such, as in, come forth with your ideas and your observations and your reflections, because there's no such thing as a bad idea, observation, or reflection. But that actually requires leaders to relinquish control and strive to distribute trust across the organization, which is no mean feat for a lot of people.
No, indeed. And I mean, that what you've just spoken about there kind of connects with some of the things we've spoken about in previous episodes, and is really setting us up wonderfully for the final episode in the series. More to come on that in due course. So what do you see as, for example, three key drivers of the reskilling emergency? And I know you've touched on a number of what you've been speaking about, but if you were to highlight three key drivers, what do you think they would be?
So I think, we can't underestimate the impact that investment in digital technology, new digital technology, is having on our workplaces. It creates just increasing arrays of technological choices, which bring its own set of dilemmas. Like, how do I know that I have the intelligence to make a good choice on behalf of my employer as to the best technology to use? You know, there's so much to consider here, but digital technology was already progressing at pace and scale before artificial intelligence and generative AI became the latest evolution and iteration. And I think AI has the capacity to accelerate the pace at which we need to reskill, both in terms of how we learn to use the tools that are available to us, but also we urgently need critical thinkers at work to identify some of the as broadly as possible, the ethical issues that surround the mainstream adoption. So we've not tended to think about workplaces as being spaces where we contemplate ethical issues. In fact, if you look at what's gone on in America and the UK in the last 15, 20 years, we've defunded the humanities in universities in order to progress the STEM agenda. But actually, we urgently need the humanities, because where else does philosophical and ethical debate come from? So there's a piece around the pace of technological change. And of course, even if we wanted to slow down the pace at which our organization adopts and embraces these technologies, we are caught in the bind that what are our competitors doing? What are our competitors doing? So that's problematic. And going back to some previous episodes, the globalized commercial landscape adds rocket fuel to those dilemmas because of the reality, or the perceived reality, that we are in some kind of technological arms race with other nations that are pitched as our foes if we don't get on board with this mainstream technological adoption. So it's really hard to kind of draw out three key drivers, because it's basically like a mucky murkiness. It's like all of these things just bubbling away in a cauldron. But I think there's a commercial need to embrace technology. I also think, when technology is unleashed, unveiled to the general public, particularly in the case of social media platforms, and I think AI smattering on top of social media platforms it exacerbates a pre-existing problem. Mark Zuckerberg is on record as having said that, those idiots, they trust me to give me their data. The data was the new oil. Now attention is the new oil, because attention and time spent on social media platforms can be packaged up and sold to advertisers. So, therein lies the rub. There's not enough time to take a step back and take stock intelligently of what the unforeseen consequences could be, and nor has there, until this point, been adequate education in either an educational setting or in an executive educational setting as to what these, how do we even go about understanding what these consequences could be? Like, we've never had to confront these kind of issues. I know your background, Steve, is in pharma, so presumably that is a more constrained environment where the ethical debate of what new medications and pharmacological products could be on the population at large. But it doesn't seem to me that we have the time to wait for those kind of ethical considerations in the same way that the stringent controls that exist in pharma would make sure that when products, are released onto the public or into the public, adequate checks and balances have been undertaken.
That's a really interesting perspective that I hadn't thought of before. If you look at the power of some of these new technologies, and the examples that you cited around social media, and you can draw parallels between that and other regulated industries, and yet there's an industry that's not regulated. That's really fascinating. I love that perspective. Um, so we've kind of spoken about some dangers, I suppose, associated with ignoring the reskilling emergency, given the emergence of some of these new technologies. But what's the potential positive outcome? If we get this right, if we do the reskilling right, what does that potential future look like, and how does it contrast with a potential future around, say, 2030 that gets it wrong?
So I think there are lots of upsides to explore. I think this is, the more I think about work and the future of work, this to me is nothing short of a paradigm shift. It quite literally is a game-changing moment in time, but I would go as far as to say it's a decade in time, right? And a decade is a very tiny blip in the long trajectory of humanity. And I think, if we could recreate our workplaces as places of learning, as places, Harold Jarkey, who's done a lot of work in personal knowledge mastery, he runs courses online, he talks about learning in the flow of work. If we were to stop thinking about workplace learning as something that gets done to an individual by an organization at intermittent points, and started to think instead about how we might best foster a collective culture of continuous learning and normalize learning just as a thing that we do, where we share our learnings, where we're constantly coming, when we come into contact with our colleagues, we're sharing, what have we learned this week? How do we adapt to this situation? How do we deal with that situation? There's a really interesting quote that I like to refer to that John Hagel was supposed to have said. And John Hagel was kind of a future of work, I guess, pioneer, hired by Deloitte. Deloitte had their Centre for the Edge, and John was a thinker and a keynote speaker. I think he's retired now. But one of the things that he said, which I just think is so apposite, he said, "We cannot codify and transfer predetermined skills and existing knowledge fast enough to match the rates of change in industry." So for organizations to run training programs and training departments, you can only run a training department if you can identify ahead of the need what the training need is, and then apply it in a one-size-fits-all uniform way. So training at its heart is brilliant if you want to create stable and efficient operating environments, but it completely is counterproductive if you want to nurture environments that are adaptive and that are able to navigate complexity. So effectively, the antidote is, and the opportunity is, create environments where learning is normalized and expected and celebrated, such that every day is a learning day, and it becomes absolutely normal to talk about what you've learned this week, and what, you know, what you've tried that is different this week. You know, work is now a massive experiment. That's it, end of. And yes, you know, we have this amazing advantage, which is that we can apply some of the tools and techniques from science. If we were to treat work as an experiment, then, you know, I mean, crikey, it's a long time since I studied science, going back to school. But what I do remember is that you always had your list of apparatus, and you always had a documented method, and then you always documented what your outcomes were. And that is the basis, is it not, for experimental documentation? Well, we've got that. We know that methodology works in science. So let's apply that to the way that we work now and see whether that transforms the pace at which we are able to progress, both individually as learners and organizationally, as we try and evolve and adapt to these new market forces.
And it feels then that the opposite to that would be organizations being left behind. And the leaving behind strikes me as being twofold. One is the less you learn compared to your competitors about how the world is evolving, how the marketplace is evolving, and how people within the organization learn. You know, that feels like that's going to be really costly to the organization from a very kind of economic point of view. But also, it's likely to be a form of differentiator for potential employees coming into the organization. Do I want to go into an organization that invests in me and helps me continue to learn, or do I want to be in an organization that has a reputation of not doing that at all?
Right, 100%. And therein lies, you know, if organizationally you have a reputation for being a slow adopter,
Mm.
then, you know, people with the most highly sought after skills are going to give you a very, very wide berth. And, you know, there is that piece, isn't there? You know, the World Economic Forum has produced various reports about the future of jobs, and I honestly don't know this number that I'm about to cite. I don't know whether it comes from the most recent future of jobs report, and I suspect even if it did, it is now overlaid by the realities of generative AI and how that is actually landing. And I think that's anything but clear. But at one point, the World Economic Forum was saying that 69 million new jobs would be created by 2027 and 83 million existing jobs eliminated. Those are jobs, but you've got to extrapolate that and say, right, there will be a vast array of businesses in that mix who specialize in those existing jobs that are about to go obsolete. If they do not sharply pivot and adapt and spin up new relevant market offerings, they too will go obsolete. And at the very least, leadership needs to upgrade its thinking. I know we're going to come on to that, but you know, there's so much at play here.
It is, yeah, it is fascinating. It's interesting that, you know, we've kind of touched on leadership through all the previous episodes. It seems to be kind of emerging as a more and more critical issue. So having looked at, you know, what the examples of reskilling are, talked a bit about some of the key trends, and then thought about these kind of positive and negative outcomes. What kind of actions could an organization take right now with this insight to help them evolve and develop successfully?
So, with absolutely no budgetary requirement whatsoever, the easiest entry point is to kickstart an internal conversation about continuous learning and what that could look and feel like to each individual internal stakeholder. Everybody will have thoughts on that. It is, as proven in the psychological research, an innate human motivator to want to become better at one's craft over time. DC and Ryan wrote about this in their self-determination theory in the 80s, I think it was. So everybody will have an opinion on how they might improve themselves and become better at what they do. I think, the conversation has to be public because there is no one size fits all. It's a collaborative, inclusive, all hands on deck kind of conversation. But what does learning in the flow of work actually mean in your specific operating context? What are the things that are true this week that weren't true last week? And what are the things that next week could be flipped again? That's a whole conversation that, if facilitated well, kind of underpins the beginnings of the promotion of a culture of continuous learning. But coming back to the leadership piece, Steve, where are the senior execs and how are they role modeling what continuous learning looks like? Because all behavior change is reinforced and happens more effectively when there are role models showing what the new behavior expectation is. And I think, all of this requires that we create cultures that are underpinned by openness, mutual positive regard, and radical transparency. And in a lot of organizations, that those things are anathema. I can never say that word. However, therein lies a learning opportunity.
Yeah. That's been brilliant. I mean, I was just jotting down some of the kind of final thoughts that particularly struck me, and I think one of the things that we've been speaking about is change being a constant, if not exponential, and that in itself suggests that continuous learning is the thing that we should be doing. I really love the quote, "Learning in the flow of work," because learning and training can feel like it takes people away from work, can't it? And maybe that's part of a reluctance perhaps to invest in it enough. But learning in the flow of work seems to make perfect sense. And I love your phrase as well about work as an experiment. Because I think that's absolutely crucial. Because, gosh, isn't experimenting the way that we learn? And I think the overarching way that I'd characterize what we've spoken about, and we've mentioned this as well in previous episodes, is humanizing learning, and focus on people as well as the kind of the technical stuff, and focus on how we equip people best within the organization to continue to support the organization's success.
100%. I think the sooner we move away from an outdated perception of learning and teaching that entails somebody stood at the front of a classroom didactically instructing, that's not what is going to help us move through this next phase of turbulence. Social learning is what is going to help us move through. So that is the promotion and manifestation of as many conversations that articulate what we've learned and how we're learning it, so that we can reflect on the process and collectively help one another move forward. So it's far less individualistic, grade oriented, I'll tell you how things are done around here, and far more inclusive, collaborative, let's compare notes on how we think things are going around here and what we can do. And it's, it's absolutely, when you think about it, it's a no-brainer, to harness the innate goodwill of people to share their intelligence. What is not to like about that? But to do so requires those who have fought hard to get into the upper echelons of management and leadership to relinquish control, and therein lies a challenge.
Kat, that's been absolutely superb. I suspect we could go on talking about this and pretty much every topic that we've covered so far for much longer than we've planned for. Kat, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
In the podcast description, you'll find a link to the Working the Future website and how you can get hold of Kat to find out more about what Working the Future does. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss a future episode again. Don't forget to tell your friends and colleagues about the Informing Choices mini pod, and we'll see you on another episode very soon.